Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out and taking a little bit of time out of your Wednesday night for some professional development. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bill Albertson, and I'm the president of Penn TCALC East, and I am the co-chair of the webinars committee. And so tonight we're starting a brand new event, our An Evening With series, where we interview people with a variety of different expertises that relate to the work that we do every day in TESOL. And I can think of no better person to kick that off with than Manisha Kaw, our resident expert on prepositions. Manisha currently teaches in the intensive English language program at Temple University. And before that, she received her Ph.D. in English language education at the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad. And so, Manisha, thank you so much for taking time tonight to talk to us. We're going to do this in the style of an interview, and I'll talk to Manisha for about 45 minutes. And then for the last 10 minutes, I'll open it up to the audience to interact with Manisha. Audience members, if there are any questions that you have, you can feel free to put them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat, and Manisha knows that this interview can go anywhere depending on what questions you put in the chat, and I know she's ready for it. So, Manisha, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and what inspired you to focus on prepositions in your research?
So my background was actually, I started as a lit major. It's been a long journey, and then found it boring. So did something, just took up one course in TESOL and found it interesting, and then never looked back. But prepositions were particularly interesting because all the teachers, during TESOL courses, our training was like, never mark students down for prepositions. They're hard, they're difficult, but never did they ever explain why. Why are they difficult? What's going on with them? Why are they so delayed in acquisition? So I think that kind of was playing in the back of my head, but I would have honestly never chosen prepositions. But I went up to my advisor and I said, give me something challenging. And she said, oh, really? Really? So here you go. And believe it or not, the first reading that she offered me was on prepositions. So I said, oh, this is challenging. Oh, I'm going to do it. It took 5 years to figure prepositions out. Uh,
And so, tell us a little bit about the research that you did. Did you conduct any studies? How did that go?
so it touches upon many areas just within applied linguistics. There's something called lexical semantics. So I'm looking at lexical semantics of prepositions from we know there are different schools of thought in linguistics. So I'm looking at second language acquisition of, you know, prepositions, but from a very cognitive linguistics background, not from syntax or not from any other school of thought. Now, these are semanticians. These are hardcore, semantics. And that's where lexical semantics comes into the picture. So my work was primarily on second language acquisition of prepositions, but from the outlook of cognitive linguistics.
Okay.
And yes, I did. Sorry, Bill, I just wanted to complete. Um, I did conduct a study, and it was a cross-linguistic study. So I looked at their first language, and I looked at how these kids were acquiring prepositions in English, and I found people may not like it. There was no interference whatsoever because we had different age groups that we started, with very, very basic, like age 7 and 8. And then there were, that's where they start English in their school, like very early curriculum setup. And up till ages, I think, 12 or 13. And we did not find interference at any point of time. And mind you, their first language is drastically different from English. So then we looked at some English studies and how do native speakers of English acquire. They make somewhat kind of the same, you know, threshold points, and they express these difficult prepositions the same way. So it was pretty interesting to see it cross-linguistically.
So when you say there was no interference, you mean there was no first language interference on the,
Absolutely.
so the second language users of English acquired prepositions in roughly the same way as the native speakers?
I cannot extend beyond what I saw, but my research was able to say that there was no first language interference. So the errors that they made were more consistent with the English language rather than the first language. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so they were making similar errors to
That's right.
their
That's
native
right.
speaking counterparts. That's interesting. And these are early language learners. They're still within their, critical period.
Do you want to start with that today? Critical period? No.
Or sensitive period, if you prefer. Okay, so young learners. Now, I know that you've been teaching adult learners most of your life at Temple. Do you notice similar patterns with them, or do you think it's really different?
Bill, I mostly teach advanced levels, so I don't get
Right.
to see the onset of prepositions in their case. And remember, these are adult learners, so they come with a great deal of English when they come to United States. But they do have problems, but those problems are mostly like, like we said, we have these figurative expressions which are like formalized, and that we have to learn them. I'm just thinking of an example. Um, Dependence on something, for
Right,
example,
right.
like why would dependence take on after the preposition? We may understand it, we may have a logic, but then, when students try to find too much logic there's none to be found. It's just that just learning. Those are the kinds of mistakes that are more prominent I would say, in advanced learners, because they've not fully grasped the idea that a preposition is very, very fixed there. They cannot put semantics into it. So those are the issues there.
Okay, so the ones that kind of have logic to them at 3 o'clock, I suppose that has a certain logic to it. We can say that all time expressions have at if it's a clock time. Those kinds of more rule-driven things they'll remember, but the ones where you have to remember the verb or the adjective with the preposition as a lexical item,
As a
those
chunk. Yep.
are the chunk. Those are the ones that they're having more difficulty with.
Yeah. Because it's like an itemized learning, every verb plus preposition, every noun plus preposition, there's no rule binding them to say, all right, with these kinds of nouns, we only accept these kind of preposition. They just, every occurrence is a new learning. So they have to just learn it one by one, So if they haven't learned it, obviously they're going to just fill in the blank with any preposition that pops up in their head.
Right. Just like when I was learning French, I remember getting papers back where the prepositions were all changed because, we just kind of put it whichever one fits or seems to work or sounds right, and sometimes in a second language. That doesn't always fly. I'm going to throw this one at you. This might be an interesting one to go with. So I think that most people, when they think of prepositions or the study of prepositions, their mind goes to syntax. At least for me, it does, because I always think like preposition plus gerund, and that I kind of put that in the world of syntax. For you, it seems like you primarily see it as a semantic study. Can you talk a little bit about why you think it falls into semantics more so than syntax, or even, I guess, morphology wouldn't really work so much?
All right. If you promise that you're not going to have a debate with me, I
I won't
will.
have a debate. I won't have a debate.
Absolutely. So when we look at the meaning component of prepositions, they are real. There's a lot going on in prepositions. They throw some really big challenges. And somehow I wanted you to ask me this question because this is the way I looked at prepositions, so I can sort of not confidently, but I can comfortably talk about it.
Mhm.
So they have to be conceptualized, you know, all over again. So if you were a second language learner of French, you have to conceptualize those French prepositions. Now, I'm not using the word learned, but conceptualized, because by conceptualization, I do not mean a new word, for a new object. Like this is a table.
Right.
In Arabic, it has a different word, but construing space in a whole new dimension. Um, the the way English allows us to categorize relationships among objects through prepositions is drastically different from, let's say, Korean. And this was one of the things I did a sort of experiment with. For example, my Korean students do not see two objects in terms of, let's say, an apple in a bag, in terms of where the apple is with relationship to the bag. Is it in the bag? Is it on the bag? Is it beside the bag? But how tight fit or loose fit the two things are, and that's so different. The system is very different. So um, in Korean language, their prepositions differ in terms of how tight something is. Let's say an apple is inside a bag, or how loose an apple is fitting inside the bag. So this is the basic pattern of this distinction there. So my student will have to reconceptualize the notions of space to understand these relationships that prepositions indicate in English. It's almost like reprogramming the brain to process new data. So sometimes when we assume that a wrong preposition is indicative of first language interference, most likely it's simply not, because it cannot be in many cases, primarily because the perceptual domains are so distinct and so different that they cannot be overlap. They're just completely different system. It's better to recognize ideas that prepositions convey. I look at prepositions from the perspective of semantics, and I say the ideas that they convey are very abstract, very, very. There's just the image in the brain, and that image has to be created. Otherwise, in, on, at do not make any difference. They're just grammatical words in a particular language. And these words are far more abstract than, I don't know, like a quality or the notion of quantity that adjectives communicate. It will take time to decipher these abstract notions. That's one way we look at prepositions. But this might interest you, Bill, because when semanticians sort of categorize or look at any grammar item, we don't just look at its semantics. We also make people like Bill very happy and keep them in our mind. We look at how are they doing with relationship to the grammar, or the whole syntax of their the whole DNA. Let's put it that way. And that throws up the other problem. And it's like a preposition is a resident in English with dual citizenship. There are some times when they have a meaning, and sometimes they just don't. so I mean, and when we overstress on meaning, and our students also want to understand every single thing in their material, like, what does this in mean? It doesn't mean anything. Just learn it like that. Um, so I do not want to sound very confident, but this is what my observation has been. Unlike nouns, adjectives, verbs, a preposition may convey a meaning or it may not. Historically, maybe there was a reason why a community sort of shortlisted mentally a long list of prepositions, and said, no, this one sounds better. It was not a discussion, but just over a period of time, as the usage became more and more systematic, a community chose a certain preposition over others because it made sense or it seemed right. But these meanings are sort of, in some cases, not so clear or not so explicit. They are more for the value of structure rather than meaning. And there's a very pioneering work that I came across when I was doing research. She placed prepositions on a Klein, and on that Klein, she had these four categories of preposition. So a preposition is not a category; it's just type A, type B, type C, and type D. So in the first type, she was able to explain that um, it, let's say, in, for example, okay, in this first category, in has purely grammatical function. It has no no semantics associated with her. For example, her trust in her friend, or she's engrossed in her book. In these instances, in is simply a conceptualization of something that we perceive as a container, but it really does not have any meaning. It's just that it's assigning a case.
Right.
It's purely for grammatical reasons that in comes there because it has some case to assign, and that makes sense more from the syntax point of view, but not from the semantics point of view.
When you talk case, you get me excited.
See, I knew it. I knew it. so yeah, you can tell your students, let's talk about cases that prepositions assign, and they assign a lot of cases. There's a heavy load on their shoulders, little shoulders, two-letter words, but they do a mighty job of assigning cases. In this situation, they have no meaning, but they assign cases. And the second category is our very typical prepositions of space and time. Very meaningful. When you mean in English, what in means. It has a reference to a certain shape of a container and a certain position in which that object is sort of sitting inside something. So it has an associative property that you can understand, you can explain. You cannot explain the difference between in and under with an image, right? So that becomes meaningful that way. But I don't want to make it very technical, but in this situation, because cases get you excited, this one also assigns cases
Right.
in its second, I mean, in its natural form, let's say that way. And the third category, interesting or not, Bill, is adverbs.
I
Do
like a
you?
good adverb.
They do have a very strong meaning, but but they don't assign cases. So there's meaning which can be understood and which can be explained, but grammatically they don't add any, value or significance that way.
Are you
From
talking about specifically like in adverb phrases, like in the morning?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Or an adverbial, just as in any form of adverbial or adverb phrases, they do have meanings. I know you're probably looking at it from AP point of view, like adverb phrase point of view.
Right.
But yeah, hold your horses. I'm not going there. I'm just still whether it has meaning, and which teachers can explain, or whether it has no meaning, which we're just barking up the wrong tree there. Um, and your favorite, probably, if I remember, if my memory is correct, is phrasal verbs, right? Where I know. So they are quietly sitting next to a verb, almost as if, they have no role to play, but you change a preposition, you change the whole meaning. But the interesting part there is it's not the preposition which is lending the meaning, it's the verb plus the preposition construction, which is lending the meaning. So in phrasal verbs, particles again have a very strict syntactic role. There's no meaning to it. So that's her work. So let's let's conclude. I don't want to go too technical there. For us as teachers, a preposition is a preposition. Like Gertrude Stein said, a rose is a rose. No, a preposition is much more than just a preposition. There are some times when you have to tell students, learn it. I don't know. I cannot explain. And there are some times when it deems necessary to explain certain distinctions between the use of prepositions, particularly when they are in time, space, or adverbs.
The whole time you were talking, I was thinking, Manisha and I have more in common than different when I think of prepositions as more of their syntactic function, and you think of them more as a semantic function. Samiha, who's here today, had to sit through my linguistics class where we did trees, and we talked about where the prepositional phrases go, and adjuncts versus complements, all that fun stuff, case assignment, extra exciting stuff. But we also talked in class about how you can make that tree, but you could also make a nonsensical sentence with that tree. The semantics have to drive it and, all of that fun stuff. So, the semantics people and the syntax people can all get along and share prepositions in harmony. At Penn at least we're all about getting along. But I want to turn to phrasal verbs, and I'm going to throw a tough one at you. So a while back, it might have been 10 years ago at Temple, I think George Lakoff was visiting and he was speaking about phrasal verbs. And one of the things that he said that I haven't been able to forget is that the preposition particle on a phrasal verb is not as accidental as we might think. And he was trying to demonstrate that the prepositions that were chosen do have some sort of meaning that can make sense. And he gave some explanation. He had some of his PhD students talk about it. I never found that to be a super useful way to teach it to my students. But I want to ask you, do you think that those prepositions are meaningful in some pedagogical way? Or do you think that the just memorize it way is the more accurate way to go?
That's such an important question. You know, I have to. I don't want to. I'm not here to prove anybody right or wrong, but
Right.
I'm just basing, and I'm not an expert. Did you call me an expert in the beginning? No, I'm not. I should have sent out that disclaimer in the beginning. But it's just on the basis of both my classroom experience, what I can do as a teacher, and whatever little I've learned through my research. It is true, Bill, that in if you were to sort of do a historical linguistic analysis of any language, you'll find that there's logic to everything.
Right.
It is true, and that is what anthropologists do. They do try to find these connections, and that's their job. That's a very important part of our linguistics. But they have those meaningful content has been so frozen in time. So
Mhm.
what seems so obvious at a certain point, and it's not at one point of time, it's like historically with use. I was reading something somewhere that when phones were a new thing, people were still juggling with what preposition to use. Was it over? Was it on? That's very interesting. So many people used over and many used on, but ultimately they said, no, okay, let's just use over, for example. And that's how, so there is some meaning to it. So a native speaker is constantly thinking about logic and why over would make more sense than talk in the phone, for example. But
Right.
that's also correct. So it is true, yes. But from the pedagogical point of view, what you're trying to say has been tried by this lady, and I critiqued her, and unfortunately, I forgot her name. She was proposing a prototypical approach. It's called the prototypical approach, based on, the prototypical prototypes. And you take a core preposition and explain to students with these elaborate charts how in came to have these different faces and usages, even in non-semantic situations. And, they get a picture. She was, unfortunately, I don't know if she looked at her data herself properly. She would say that no, students did not do any kind of learning. But that's where semanticians have to be very careful in terms of what can be taught in a classroom and what practically cannot be. And I did critically review it, and I said, can you just leave students alone and give them some material, highlight some prepositions, and say, don't ask me why this in or how it landed there. I have no idea, but just learn it as a whole chunk.
Yeah.
But again, Bill, just to be aware and cautious, it's what cognitive, I mean, my brain has been corrupted in a particular way. So now I only see world in that way. And
Right.
in cognitive linguistics, it's usage-based learning. If you see it in front of you, that's the better way to learn something that is so abstract. It does have logic, but can we explain logic to every single preposition?
Right.
Maybe. Maybe.
Well, this brings me to a question that I was going to ask earlier that I'm wrapping myself back around to. So you were talking about Korean and how there's a different conceptualization of the world to figure out prepositions. And then I think of French, where they say, I'm at the telephone, which, sure, has its own logic. But based on how you're describing it, it sounds like it doesn't really matter what language you're coming from. You're going to have a roughly equal difficulty with prepositions, which really is very different from what one would guess. Someone coming from French or Spanish to English typically has a much easier time than someone coming from, say,
Chinese.
Chinese, Japanese, or Arabic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, in Chinese, you say at everything and then another preposition if you need it. So when the logic is different, so at the telephone in French, for example, um, what am I trying to say? How do you go about, getting them to wrap their head around this new conceptualization when everything else in the language lines up pretty closely?
You mean preposition as a category?
Yeah, so, French and English syntactically are really, really similar. The only major difference is the flip-flopping of the adjective, right?
Yeah.
So then prepositional phrases fall in the same places and all that, but then you're getting different prepositions frequently. And we were talking about how there's a logic to what prepositions historically have been used, yet a language so close to English that English has borrowed so much from has so many different prepositions. And so, what are the pedagogical implications for that? How do you get a student to start wrapping their head around it other than telling them just deal with it, which is what I was told when I was taking French? And how does that even happen?
I hope I understand your question, Bill.
Dude, I hope I understand my question too.
No, let's try and make sense of it together. So probably the best way to answer that question would be it's developmental.
Mhm.
Okay. There are certain prepositions that will be acquired before its other usages. Remember, a preposition is not just a preposition. It has abstractness to it, and as you go up you know, you go through different categories, you realize that when there's not much meaning to it, which you cannot explain, they will take some time for them to notice. And a lot depends on teaching there, but I'm going to come to that later. So let's go back to the abstract category, but within that abstract category, something that is perceivable, something that you can point to and say, and I think this is, if you remember Kathy does most of this thing, which is like objects inside the box. So those early spatial and temporal prepositions will probably be acquired earlier than its other usages. And it just has to be shown. I'm not sure if those grammar books are still around, but when I was working and analyzing, I was able to unearth these old grammar books where they had images, like cat in the cart,
Yeah,
it's in the cart with an arrow pointing that cart. So those can be easily they are teachable. You can teach them, and beginner classes have to teach them. You have a question, go on.
they still have those in side by side.
Oh, lovely. Yes, because
Rob knows
that's
how I feel about side by side, but I know that they're there.
yeah, so they will have to be so the conceptualization of space does not happen automatically.
Right.
There has to be input, and if the input is imagistic, it's image. It's easier. At that level, those things are really important. But as you go up, prepositions are not just limited to how they explain space. We just went over that. It just becomes more and more illogical, and that's where learning them as a vocabulary item,
Mhm.
like abandon something. Abandon does not take a preposition, so you need to know that there's no preposition there. But in other cases, wherever an adjective plus a preposition, we need to learn it like that, and it's up to teachers to point out, notice that there is a preposition sitting, because if we're always about, and we're doing a good job, we're always about meaning, spelling, pronunciation of, nouns and adjectives and verbs. But these poor prepositions, they are always overlooked. And that's where the gap comes in. We don't ever tell our students, notice there's an on sitting right after that verb. Don't forget that. That's part of the construction. So you learn it as a whole.
Right.
Um, did I answer your question?
You did, but I want to push it one step further. So, and again, I'm thinking of French, but it probably applies across the Romance languages. So, in the Romance languages, those spatial prepositions are going to be the same. Yet, when we go to temporal, which is like the next step, because you're learning, that's part of that dirty dozen that you learn when you start learning a language, right? Days of the week, time, all those things. You've already got a difference because in French and Spanish, you say at Monday.
Mm-hmm.
And so it already starts to fall apart then, um, which is why I was surprised earlier to hear you say that you didn't find a whole lot of negative transfer from the L1, because I would think that that would be your first time getting that negative transfer. I know that for me as a French learner, I was using English to guess the prepositions in French until I got better, and I still guess sometimes. So, what is it that it goes? So, do you think that the spatial ones are really the only ones that are concretely conceptual? Or,
Spatial ones are the most conceptual. Time is still, you don't see time.
right,
You have to, again, time is something that needs to be reconceptualized.
right,
Um, but I think time is harder than space because you cannot show time, you can show space.
right. So, I think the big thing that we're getting out of this is that L1 has very little influence on the acquisition of prepositions in another language beyond potentially the spatial.
Bill, it's been a trend. It's been a trend. If you pick up any second language a journal, prominent ones, they've stopped accepting papers that go as far as showing interference, because you can't just say because your language does not have at, or your language uses at like this, therefore you are going to you can't predict that, because it's a lot depends on processing, a lot depends on how something is taught. And remember, English is still a foreign language in many countries. English is mostly a second language in a whole lot of countries that does have that has changed the way, I think, the level at which learners begin to learn English. Unfortunately, not communicative way, but whatever, some sort of way. They do have some kind of input. You mentioned about Romance languages. I have to tell you that I don't know about Romance languages, but I do know that British English is so very different from American English when it comes to using prepositions. So when I was new in America and everybody was saying on the test, I was like, why on the? It's supposed to be in the test, not
Right.
on the test. So it's not just first language. It's also because these students are coming from different Englishes. It may not be wrong. It's just that it's just how they've learned it. So it's not always the first language interference. It's also English interference, but from a very different world.
Yeah, just like at the weekend still sounds so strange to my ears, yet that's what they do in the UK,
That's
right?
exactly, yeah.
So when you have a student who's struggling with prepositions, are there any particular activities that you find useful to use in class? Let's go to the practical.
Yeah, as I said, from whatever little I've learned over these years, or probably I've been telling myself that even if I see a mistake in prepositions, probably not interference. It's a learning error. So I must have, at some point of time, convinced myself, which means I can fix it by drawing attention to it. So, as I said, if I'm teaching beginners or intermediate level students, then I would probably take these colorful markers and highlight every preposition, in the material, or the ones that I feel are very important because that's the right level. If they're learning B1 vocabulary, but there's a C2 item there, I'm not going to bother. I'm going to leave it alone. So I can be very selective there, but I will have them all highlight these prepositions and say, see, they are there, and they're there because they belong with the sentence. So you learn the verb plus the preposition, or you'll learn whatever word is before it, so you see the whole construction.
Right.
Okay, so the problem with students is, and it's probably I share the guilt. Adjectives are so important, verbs are so important,
Right.
and all these words are important for preposition. It's
Yeah.
just a little guy there, but that guy is also equally important. And that's what happens when they sit down to talk or when they sit down to write. They know the adjective, they know how it's spelled, but they don't remember what preposition, whether there is a preposition or there's no preposition, or what preposition goes there. So I think
Right.
from the very beginning, if we make a very um, conscious effort to remind them, knock knock, there's a preposition, highlight them, or even in feedback, sometimes I as an instructor can make an extra effort and say, I understand that you did not learn this preposition, but this word has this other companion right next to it, and you don't want to leave the companion behind. So
Right.
that's how I would do it. And I will always correct prepositions, because that's a very slippery area. I'll never say, fill it out. Why didn't you learn it? Things like that. So,
All right. Well, I want to slide this question in now that I'm in the testing world and working on English language standardized tests. Standardized tests test prepositions. There, it's no secret that on the TOEIC, which is the test that I'm working on, there are preposition items on that test where there are fill in the blanks and the students have to choose the correct preposition. And I just want your take on using prepositions as a testing point to determine where on the CEFR level or any other metric you want, um, do you find testing prepositions to be a useful metric? Do you think it should be left off completely? Where do you fall on that?
testing is such a bane of my existence as a whole. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sorry. I still want to be your friend. See, there's a difference between the testing we do every day in class and the testing like the ones that you were talking about, sure, they do want to check your proficiency. But one of the big problems I feel they have is that they always use a native speakers standards,
Mhm.
and that's a big problem there. It's easier for native speakers who have learned that language for 18 years, 19 years to sort of they've had a they've made mistakes while learning, but nobody remembers those. Um, on principle, I would say let's not test them, but
Okay.
I know they are a good measure of proficiency.
Okay. And do you think that if a student gets up into that, high B1 or high B2s into the C1 levels, do you think that challenges with preposition can impact communicative competence? Or do you think that communicative competence can work fine without being strong in prepositions? Whereas with adjectives and nouns and verbs, you need to know them to communicate. Can you get away
Again,
without good preposition?
sorry. Again, it depends what preposition you're talking about. So if you use a wrong preposition next to a verb, we'll still understand the message, right? Because it does not have any semantic value there. But if you say, I'm going to meet you, and use a wrong location there, then you're going to run into a problem. So I think what you're communicating through your prepositions is different.
But the spatial ones, are students that are at A1 and into A2. They're going to know those spatial ones because they learn them really early, right? It's in book one of side by side. And so I'm going back to testing those doesn't really discriminate those higher levels. It's those ones that are potentially more idiomatic.
Right,
Uh,
exactly. Yes,
but
yes.
so you think that having more accuracy in those is a good measure of proficiency, even if they're not necessarily a measure of communicative competence.
So you are looking at a big bonus, like right in the beginning of your new job, right? You want me to give you these important insights. I would say yes, Bill. From if you're finding a way to measure somebody's proficiency in language, then yeah, prepositions is a way to go. And also, I don't know if I should tell you, also the articles and the prepositions are the hardest to learn, irrespective of which language you come from.
Right.
So, yeah.
Um, and I perhaps this question is coming slightly out of order. And you've already kind of answered it because you said, first language interference is really minimal. But what about students coming from languages that have completely different adpositional rules, or maybe very few, if any, prepositions at all? I'm thinking like agglutinative languages where they're coming on as suffixes instead of prepositions. How do you approach taking those suffixes and turning them into prepositions in their mind, especially when they can be so different? I'm sure I told you I've been studying Finnish for about a year now by myself. I haven't made a whole lot of progress, but wrapping my head around having a completely different conceptual notion of all of these things has been an incredibly steep hill to climb.
When you are in an English language classroom, you could be anybody or you could have any first language. It doesn't matter to me because I don't know Finnish. That's
Right.
my good luck. And I'm not going to ever use Finnish as a starting point. I'm just going to
Right.
use English input as a starting point. I don't have any way of comparison to say in your language it sits
Right.
here, but in English it sits here. So I think input is for me again, Bill. I told you it's just a perspective. For me, it's all in the input. So the right input at the right time, which is pitched at the right level, can do the trick. Which is why those beginner level classes and the teachers who teach those levels, hats off to those guys because I don't think I have that skill, but that skill is extremely important to show and point out. Languages are not in a lecture, but they will notice and they will say, they will see that, oh, there's something going on. This word is sort of um, showing space or telling me where things are.
So it's
But
all about noticing on the part of the student.
it's always noticed. Remember, during our TCALC classes, we read a theory. I don't remember what it was, but there was one theory which highlighted the importance of attention.
Yes.
And that's where we are in second language. We're saying no matter what you do, just do draw their attention to whatever you want them to learn. And without attention, um, I don't know, a lot of things could be lost.
Students need to what do they say? Noticing during input and monitoring during output. I'm going to ask one final question, and then I'm going to let Rob ask the question that's in the chat that he put in there. If you could add one thing to every ESL teacher's toolkit for teaching prepositions, what would it be?
Um, hmm. Yeah, this sounds like I'm preaching, and I don't want to preach.
Preach, Manisha.
I'm just going to go and say my observations. What are some things I will not do? Okay. Is that okay? So I will never assume that um, an error in preposition is as a result of the first language. I don't care. I don't care where that came from. For me, the only reality is that there's an error. And because I have a little bit of linguistics background, I try to play with it. I will probably look at the frequency of errors. I'll see if there's a pattern. Is the student learned this particular preposition, let's say in? Is he or she making these constant mistakes with just this one preposition, which means something is wrong.
Mhm.
But that's highly unlikely. But I will do some error analysis, but teachers don't always have that kind of time. So um, it's not always because of interference. It's just probably the learning is incomplete, or there's still a great deal to be learned. I would say I would treat that error um, as a lexical error,
Mhm.
and say, the complete chunking was not in place. The student was very careless when he or she learned the verb or the adjective and did not learn the preposition. Um, I will also be aware that when it comes to language acquisition, there are so many factors that play their part. And interference is just an outdated excuse. But um, if you remember, we did something called error analysis. That is so helpful in the classroom. So a little bit of error analysis can help us. And as I said, pointing out to, while you're teaching them in the reading, whenever there's input, whatever kind of input there is, I think highlighting those prepositions is a good way. It sort of builds up. It builds up positively in their long-term memory, whether color coding, oh, there's in somewhere next to that word, for example. So um, I particularly face problems with students who are visual learners.
Hmm.
You know what I'm talking about, Bill? When they're visual learners, they make an image in their head of every word or words together. So I've always faced difficulty because they take on, in, over in English literally,
Yes.
and that's kind of challenge for me. And it's just my weakness. I just don't know how I can help them. But one has to be, as a teacher, aware that sometimes the mistakes in writing is not just because the learning has not happened. It's just that the student is learns in a different way. It's just a different. The brain's just wired differently.
Right. And I
Um,
think a lot of maybe I'm overstepping here, but I think a lot of us in linguistics are auditory learners. And so for me at least, it was always challenging to deal with visual learners and always have to remember, oh, Bill, you got to do colors and things like that.
Yeah, and that always helps. That always that not always, not for all kinds of learners, but it's an effort, and I think this effort it has proved to be for me in the right directions. Um, the other thing with prepositions that I remember both as a teacher and as a teacher who's sort of instructing, teaching vocabulary and giving feedback, I do remember that not just prepositions, but all language items are developmental in nature. So we teach only what students can parse, perceive, and practice. As I said, if there's a higher level word, just drop it. It's just too
Right.
early. And these are the things that we as teachers need to be aware of. Just gauge, we don't have to have a very strict measure there. So and definitely, Bill, do not test it. So if something, but in your world, I think that's all right. But in my world, I need to be careful what I'm testing. I don't want to be mean because it is going to take a long time for certain prepositions to find the right place. I'm not going to rush into testing them. I'm not going to rush. I'm not. I'm not going to do testing part until a very good, let's say, good level where I'm confident that yes, they seem to have acquired a good amount of concepts about this in this language. And I would say, I don't know if this is helpful, but I do try to give students some strategies that they can use to continue to learn on their own, like underlining those words and the words sitting next to them, just to keep the structure in the mind
Right.
and and continue to learn on their own. I'm not sure if these were helpful, but that's just what I do.
Very helpful. And as promised, even though it's 9 minutes later than I promised, or 4 minutes later than I promised, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for any questions or comments for Manisha. Rob, do you want to talk about what you put in, and then I will read what Samiha put in if she's not able to turn on her microphone?
That really wasn't intended as a question. Just kind of an observation. I think, Bill, you were suggesting that even if there's not um, linguistic transfer, that maybe there's like a conceptual level transfer that some languages have better equipped their speakers to learn prepositions generally, if not particular prepositions, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah. I
And
mean,
then, yeah,
especially for speakers of agglutinative languages where it can be
you've
really,
been on a agglutinative language kick lately, I've heard. Lots of examples I'm from.
yeah.
My point was just that if that's the case, I could imagine a scenario in which prepositions are a predictor of proficiency with speakers of one L1, but less so with another L1, but yeah, it's not an actual like question.
I believe that. That it sounds about right.
I'll
Samiha,
believe it.
and then we'll go to Daniel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm definitely resonate with a lot of what you said, Bill, about, having tough time with prepositions when you're learning a second language. Getting the papers marked back just like you did, because I'm learning Italian and they got the in and the a, and it's like, why is it a gennaio and in inverno? Why is it different for months and days? It's really hard to get over that. So I think it's interesting to sort of switch the lens here and analyze a little bit more closely how all these different prepositions describe things in special relation to each other rather than just trying to like brute force memorize everything. So I wanted to thank Manisha for talking about this and putting this in a way that I can understand a little bit better, and I'll definitely look into this research further.
You. It's very interesting. It'll keep you busy for 5 years, I promise you.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, and Italian has that particular one that gets people, that da,
Yeah,
which
it's
is
awful though. It's so awful.
killer of a preposition.
Yeah.
Daniel?
I work with adult learners, and I've been doing a lot with phrasal verbs, and I think agree you can't always find meaning. You can say get in, get out, like say with the car, that has some meaning, but you can't always analyze everything and logically understand it. So, but I appreciate your comments about phrasal verbs.
Yeah, Phrasal verbs are Bill's favorite too. We all love them, right? Thank you,
Depends on the
Danny.
day and depends on the phrasal verb. Any other audience comments or questions? All right. With that, go
I
ahead,
think
Dan.
Just to say, in college, I studied ancient Greek,
Mm.
and studying the Greek grammar, I think that helped me. And actually, also, I studied French and Spanish, but especially Greek helped me give a grammatical framework for understanding English. And I still remember learning the prepositions in Greek, and they were, I think, very spatial. You could see the three-dimensional table, and you could put the prepositions, on that table. So that kind of stuck with me a little bit, even as I work with English.
that is interesting. Yeah, I did not study Greek prepositions, but we did a lot of comparison with Chinese prepositions. Does anybody have any idea about Chinese prepositions? It's like a continuation of verbs. Oh, right there. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah, hello. I
I'm
have a
so
degree in
sorry.
Asian studies.
I know, you'll forgive me, Bill. So they don't really look like prepositions. They're like continuation of the verb. It's like a verb series. So how does a student who has not studied linguistics, figure out that, oh, I need to replace a Chinese preposition into this English structure? You have to have that kind of training to do that. So the systems are so different that they don't really interact with each other. But again, maybe there are some cases where interference does happen or the systems do overlap. But mostly I think it's helpful to know different systems. Particularly, I think many people here are bilinguals and multilinguals, and you do realize that it's very helpful. Daniel, you said that space was three-dimensional. It kind of helps broaden the
Mhm.
mind, make the
Yeah.
mind more acceptable of differences.
Yeah, in Chinese, many prepositions, they can just be your verb in the sentence.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and I remember us asking our Chinese professor that early on, and she said, just study what you need to know for your tests, and eventually, if you go to China to study, you will know which ones to use. And I would say that I am at a point where I'm probably at about a 95% accuracy of picking out the right ones, just because there's been so much input
Input.
to
Right.
bring it
Input.
to bring it full
We
circle.
keep coming back to input again and again because it's so important.
I've heard a lot of Chinese, I've read a lot of Chinese, and now I just know, and I can't necessarily always explain why. I've heard that one a lot. All right. Well, it is 7 o'clock now, and I want to wrap things up with a few announcements from Penn Soliste. Our call for proposals for our spring conference on May 3rd just went out. So if you're a member, you'll have gotten that in your email, or you can go to pensoliste.org and submit a presentation proposal. We'll be back with our next webinar the second Saturday of March for our second Saturday seminar series. I don't know exactly what date that is. But we will be here the second Saturday of March from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. with another wonderful presentation. PTE Voices, our quarterly newsletter, is always accepting submissions for whatever the next issue is. So if you have an article idea of 5,000 words or less, Rob, or 1,500 words or less, I forget, 1,500. 1,500 words or less, particularly focusing on practical applications in TESOL, please submit it to us, and you can find our current and past issues on our website, pensoliste.org. Please join me one more time in thanking Manisha Kaw for her time tonight. This was absolutely wonderful. So thank you, Manisha.
Thank you so
And
much, Bill. This was fun. You were right about it.
we hope to see you in person on May 3rd at our conference.
Absolutely. I'll be there.
All right. We'll be putting this on YouTube for anyone who wants to review it again. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.